They pushed me off my yacht to get my inheritance. While I was fighting for my life on a desert island, they buried me in front of the cameras. A young widow giving interviews and calling herself the new mistress of an empire. But at my husband's funeral, I walked into the audience, alive. Their faces turned pale. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I read every one. I used to think I understood what silence meant. Silence was the absence of noise, of course. The kind of stillness you felt when you turned off a television or when the wind paused between gusts. But real silence, I would come to learn, was something far more profound. It was the moment when a life, a presence, a future simply stopped, and the world, arrogant and bustling, dared to continue as though it hadn't noticed. The morning of the last day began like any other on the yacht. I woke before the others, as I often did, wrapped in a light cashmere robe, and made my way barefoot to the upper deck. The Mediterranean stretched around us in every direction, impossibly blue and sparkling with that particular light you only find off the coast of southern Italy. I could smell the salt, sharp and cleansing, and for a fleeting second I let myself believe everything was fine, that my husband was still strong, that I was still needed, that the tension I'd felt growing over the last few months was nothing more than the friction of change. Breakfast was served as usual under the white awning. A silver tray held freshly baked croissants, a dish of ripe apricots, and my favorite, dark roast coffee with a touch of cardamom. I remember the way Henry smiled at me across the table, the corners of his eyes crinkling in that way that still made my chest flutter, even after 30 years. He looked tired, yes, but there was a lightness to him that morning, as if something had finally settled. Across from us sat Alex, his son from his first marriage, pretending not to scroll through emails under the table, and next to him, Brooke, his perfectly styled wife with her designer sunglasses perched like a crown atop her blonde head, even indoors. Her movements were practiced, almost theatrical. She stirred her tea like she was performing for invisible cameras. We made small talk, plans for the day, a swim near the cliffs, dinner with the crew on the lower deck. But beneath the pleasantries, something else pulsed, a quiet battle of wills, invisible but potent. I saw it in the way Brooke's smile never reached her eyes, in how Alex corrected Henry mid-sentence when he mentioned the company, in the way I had to remind myself to breathe deeply and not bite my tongue raw. Henry had asked me the night before if we could talk privately after breakfast. That wasn't unusual. He often sought my opinion before making important decisions. But there was a weight to his words I couldn't quite ignore. As we finished eating, he took my hand under the table and gave it a gentle squeeze. "We'll meet in the study," he murmured. I waited 10 minutes before joining him below deck. The study on the yacht wasn't large, but it was elegant, like everything Henry touched. Dark wood panels, leather-bound books he'd never read, and a small bar with 2 tumblers already waiting. "I've been thinking," he began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "about the foundation, about the company, about what happens when I'm not around anymore." I didn't flinch. We'd had versions of this conversation before, though never so directly. "You're not going anywhere, Henry," I said, gently. He smiled, but it was tinged with something I didn't like. "You and I both know time doesn't ask for permission." He laid it out simply. He wanted to restructure the estate. The board had grown more aggressive, and he no longer trusted Alex to steer things responsibly. The foundation, he said, had always been my heart. He wanted it placed fully under my control. Half the shares in the company, too, would shift into my name. "Let them build their futures," he said of Alex and Brooke. "But you've earned the right to protect mine." I didn't know what to say. My throat felt tight. I reached across the small space between us and held his hand. "Then let's make it official." He nodded, reaching for a folder tucked under a stack of papers. "We'll do it first thing when we're back in New York." That folder would never be signed. That night the sea was calm, deceptively so. The sky was painted in streaks of lavender and crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon. We dressed for dinner. Henry in a navy linen suit, me in an ivory silk dress he'd gifted me the Christmas after our 10th anniversary. I wore pearls. I always did when I needed to remind myself who I was. We dined with our guests, laughed at tired stories we'd all heard before. Henry seemed in good spirits, sipping his wine, his hand resting on my shoulder for most of the meal. But just as dessert was served, I felt his body tense beside me. His eyes widened slightly, and he brought a trembling hand to his chest. At first, I thought he was adjusting his jacket, but then the color drained from his face. He collapsed forward, knocking the wineglass to the floor. Time bent in that moment. I screamed his name. Alex jumped up. Brooke was frozen, lips parted but silent. The others backed away, unsure, useless. I dropped to my knees, cradled his head in my lap, shouting for the onboard medic, for anyone. But I knew. I knew before the pulse faded beneath my fingers, before the last breath left his lips in a soft, almost apologetic sigh. He was gone. I don't remember how long I sat there, rocking slightly, brushing back his thinning hair with trembling fingers. The others milled around in a daze. Someone fetched a blanket, someone else called the port authorities. It all blurred together in a fog of disbelief. At some point, I stumbled outside. The night air slapped my cheeks, and the sound of the water lapping against the hull felt deafening. I leaned against the railing, trying to steady my breath, staring out into the black void. Footsteps approached behind me. "You shouldn't be alone right now," Brooke's voice said, smooth as always, with a hint of something else. Contempt, maybe, or relief. I didn't answer. My heart was too full, too broken. The man I had shared 3 decades with, built a life with, lay inside the yacht, still, cold, already becoming memory. Brooke moved closer. I felt her presence like a chill. "Henry didn't change the documents yet, did he?" she asked, almost casually. I turned slowly, unsure I'd heard right. "Excuse me?" She smiled, a thin, flat line. "He told Alex about his plans, about giving you control. That's not going to happen now." My body froze. The words didn't register at first, and then, before I could react, before I could even think, her hands were on my back. One sharp push. It didn't take much. I fell. I didn't scream. My breath had already left me. The sea rushed up, cold and final. The last thing I saw was the pale circle of her face peering down at me, unreadable. Then she was gone. Then everything was. The water swallowed me whole. The sea was colder than I expected, even in the Mediterranean summer. When I hit the water, the shock stole my breath. I thrashed, disoriented, the silk of my dress tangling around my legs like seaweed pulling me down. I surfaced once, gasping, and caught a fleeting glimpse of the yacht's lights above me, warm and indifferent, already fading into the distance. There were no shouts, no alarm, no lifebuoy tossed into the waves, nothing. Just the hum of the engines growing fainter and the realization crashing in harder than the waves. I had been left to die. Salt stung my eyes and throat as I fought to stay afloat. My heart pounded, not from exertion but from betrayal, the weight of it dragging me as much as the water. Brooke had pushed me. She hadn't panicked, hadn't stumbled. She had looked me in the eye and removed me like I was a stain. It wasn't an accident. It was cold, calculated murder. I treaded water, gasping, crying out into the vast darkness, though no one could hear me. The stars glittered cruelly above, too far away to care. I was 70 years old. My arms weren't as strong as they once were, and the weight of my soaked dress pulled at me relentlessly. Every few minutes I had to stop shouting just to preserve enough breath to keep my head above water. My mind screamed at me to keep moving. If I stopped, even for a moment, I would sink. Time lost meaning. I don't know how long I fought. An hour? Maybe more? Before the horizon shifted and I saw it. A shape, faint but real. A small island, perhaps no more than a speck of land, barely distinguishable from the night around it. Hope flared in my chest, sharp and sudden, and I kicked harder, dragging my body forward one aching stroke at a time. My fingers were numb by the time they grazed rock. I pulled myself up onto the jagged shore, collapsing against rough stone. My knees scraped open, my elbows bled, but I didn't feel pain, only relief, raw and consuming. I had made it. Dawn crept across the sky in hesitant brushstrokes. My body shivered uncontrollably, wrung out and spent. The island was little more than a slab of rock and sand, dotted with stubborn scrub and a few clusters of palm. No buildings, no boats, no people. Nothing but emptiness. But it was land, and I was still breathing. I tried to stand but collapsed again, crawling into the nearest patch of shade beneath a bent, wind-blown tree. My mouth was parched, my skin already salt-burned, cracked at the joints. I had no food, no fresh water, no way of knowing where I was, but the sheer fact of being alive, when I was meant to be dead, gave me the first ember of defiance. I don't remember much of the first day. Sleep took me in broken snatches. The sun seared and the breeze offered little mercy. At some point I woke and crawled toward the center of the island, where the scrub was thicker. By some miracle, there was a shallow depression in the rocks that collected rainwater. The taste was earthy, bitter, but I drank greedily. I tore the hem of my dress into strips to bind the worst of my cuts. My hands were trembling, the kind of tremble that didn't come from fear but from fury. Every cell in my body screamed with rage, not because I had almost died, though that truth burned deep, but because I had trusted her. I had defended Brooke when Henry questioned her motives. I had welcomed her into the family, into my home, into our lives, and she had taken my husband's last breath as an opportunity. She had seen the opening and shoved me through it. The second day was worse. The hunger began to claw at me. I scoured the beach for anything edible, shellfish, berries, even insects, but found little. My body weakened. I began to hallucinate shadows moving in the trees, the sound of Henry's voice calling me from the waves. But I did not die. Each day that passed, I forced myself to survive. I fashioned a crude shelter from palm fronds and driftwood. I used a shard of rock to sharpen a stick for digging. I learned to catch small crabs with my bare hands and crack their shells with stone. I rationed every sip of rainwater. My body ached in ways I didn't know possible, and yet I woke each morning because I refused to let Brooke win. On the fourth night, as I lay curled in the shallow pit I dug for warmth, I thought about my life, about how carefully I had sculpted it piece by piece. I had been a nurse when I met Henry. He was already successful, already larger than life. But I hadn't been drawn to his money. I had fallen in love with the man beneath the armor, a man who took my hand when I was patching up a patient's bleeding hand and said, with a grin, "You have a surgeon's touch and a poet's eyes." They all thought I was just the second wife, the polished accessory, the elegant ornament to his empire. But Henry had always known better. He had trusted me with everything, with his health, his secrets, his fears, and that trust had not died with him. On the fifth day, a storm came. It rolled in without warning, the sky darkening in minutes, the wind screaming through the palms like a warning. I anchored myself against a rock formation, clinging to the stone as rain slashed sideways and waves roared against the island. Lightning split the sky. I screamed, not in fear, but in defiance. "I'm still here," I shouted. "Do you hear me? I'm not done." When the storm passed, the world was washed clean. Debris littered the shore, branches, flotsam, a broken crate that had likely fallen from a ship. And on the horizon, barely visible, a dark shape. A ship. I ran to the highest point of the island, waving both arms, screaming until my throat tore. The shape grew larger. A cargo vessel, red and black, slow-moving. I dragged a dry branch through the sand, spelling out, "Help!" in letters taller than I was. I tore off what was left of my dress's sleeve and climbed a tree, waving it like a flag. I saw the glint of binoculars from the ship's deck, then a flurry of motion. An hour later, a small dinghy was slicing through the water toward me. Two men reached the shore, speaking French. I collapsed to my knees as they approached. One knelt beside me, offering water. His eyes were wide with disbelief. "Madame, how long have you been here?" "6 days," I rasped. "They left me to die." They wrapped me in blankets, offered food, spoke in hushed tones to one another. They asked for my name. I hesitated. "Mary," I said. "Just Mary." They took me aboard. The ship smelled of oil and salt and metal. The crew stared as I walked unsteadily past them, barefoot, bruised, a ghost in borrowed clothes. They fed me soup, gave me dry clothing, offered a satellite phone to call the authorities. But I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. That night, in the small bunk they gave me, I sat cross-legged and stared at the wall. I traced the memory of Brooke's face, of her words, of the cold satisfaction in her voice. They thought I was gone. They were already dividing the empire, giving interviews, weeping into designer tissues while planning the transfer of power. But I was alive. And I was going to take it all back. When the ship docked in Marseille, I stepped onto the pier wrapped in a second-hand coat, my hair still salt-crusted and stiff, my body sore in ways I'd never experienced before. The early morning light gave the harbor a washed-out glow, and seagulls shrieked as they circled overhead. No one looked twice at me, just another tired passenger disembarking from a working vessel. I kept my head down and walked without limping, refusing to let the pain show. I had learned something out there on that jagged island. Pain was a luxury, and I no longer had room for luxuries. I checked into a small hotel near the port under a false name and paid in cash. The woman behind the counter barely raised an eyebrow as I signed the register. I was just another older tourist traveling alone, too proud or too poor to stay anywhere glamorous. She gave me a key and pointed to a narrow staircase. I climbed it slowly, counting every step, steadying myself on the chipped banister. Once inside the room, I locked the door, dropped the coat, and finally allowed myself to sit on the edge of the bed. I stared at my hands, bruised, scabbed, and swollen, and thought of the world I had left 6 days ago, the world I was about to step back into. They thought I was dead. Let them think that a little longer. I slept for 10 straight hours, the first real sleep I'd had since the night Henry died. When I woke, I took a long, scalding shower, letting the water burn away the last traces of salt and blood. Then I sat at the tiny desk, took out the hotel notepad, and began to make a list. Names, dates, documents, contacts, everything I needed to regain control of my life. At the top of that list was one name: Savannah Lawson. Savannah had been one of the last true journalists in an industry bloated with clickbait and manufactured outrage. She'd built a reputation on exposing corporate corruption and political fraud, and though the world had mostly forgotten her, I hadn't. Years ago, she had helped Henry shut down a smear campaign launched by a rival board member. She was sharp, discreet, and most importantly, she owed me a favor. I found her private contact through an encrypted directory we used for family security matters and sent a single message: "I'm alive. I need your help. Come alone. M." She arrived within 12 hours. I heard the knock before I saw her, 3 soft taps, evenly spaced. I opened the door slowly, revealing only my face. Savannah looked at me, her sharp blue eyes wide, her mouth frozen in disbelief. "Jesus Christ," she breathed. "Mary?" "Come in," I said quietly. She stepped into the room, removed her sunglasses, and stared at me like I was a ghost. I didn't blame her. I looked like one. But after a long moment, she sat down on the bed without another word. I told her everything. I told her about the night Henry died, about the push, about the ocean, the island, the days clawing through salt and hunger. I spoke in a flat, measured voice, as if recounting the plot of a film. Savannah listened without interrupting, though her expression darkened with every word. When I finished, she leaned back, exhaled, and shook her head. "They already buried you," she said. "Or at least, they buried an urn with your name on it. The funeral is in 2 days in New York. It's going to be streamed online, full press coverage. Brooke's been front and center since they returned. She's giving exclusive interviews. Alex looks like a man about to inherit a kingdom. I nodded. Let them have their spectacle. We'll give them something better. Savannah rubbed her temples. This is going to be complicated. I don't care. She looked at me again, harder this time. Are you prepared for what this means? For what it will cost you? I thought of the island. I thought of the moment my head broke the surface of the water, and I realized no one was coming. I already paid the price. We spent the next day gathering intel. Savannah had access to databases, confidential board memos, even private flight logs. She worked quietly, efficiently, and without pity. Through her contacts, we tracked down a former steward from the yacht Diego Vega, who had been suddenly dismissed after the voyage ended. Savannah met him in a hotel bar under the guise of a freelance reporter. After 2 drinks and the promise of immunity, he cracked. He hadn't seen the push directly, but he had heard the screams. He had seen Bruck reappear alone minutes later, calmly instructing the crew to keep course. No one had sounded an alarm. No one had searched. Later that night, Vega had asked questions. The next morning, he was handed a severance envelope and escorted off the yacht. Savannah recorded his statement. We obtained a copy of the original will Henry had drawn up, as well as the updated one he had drafted but not signed. The new version left controlling interest in the company and the foundation to me, naming Alex only as a secondary shareholder. We couldn't enforce it legally without Henry's signature, but it was a piece of the puzzle. A hacker on Savannah's team pulled satellite data from the night of Henry's death. The yacht had not stopped or altered its course during the time I went overboard. That alone was damning. Every detail added a layer to the case we were building. Every detail turned Bruck from grieving widow-in-law into a prime suspect. But the jewel of our findings came from Savannah's assistant, who had combed through Bruck's public interviews. In one clip, aired 3 days after their return, Bruck spoke about the final moments of Henry and me. She claimed I had been by his side as he passed in his sleep, and that I had whispered that we would see each other soon. A poetic lie, but one that placed me firmly on the yacht after Henry's death. The problem? That interview aired at the same time I was fighting to stay alive on a rock in the middle of the sea. Savannah's eyes gleamed when she played me the footage. "That's your dagger," she said. I nodded. "Then let's drive it in." We flew to New York on the evening of the following day. I traveled under a false name and wore a scarf to cover the still healing bruises along my neck. The city greeted me like an old enemy, familiar but hostile. Skyscrapers gleamed like blades, and the streets buzzed with blind energy. As we drove past Central Park, I glanced out the window at the trees. So many lives carried on around us, unaware that the woman they thought dead was watching. Savannah had arranged everything: cameras, microphones, legal observers. We didn't plan to speak during the funeral service. We planned to arrive at the moment of eulogy, when the lie was at its loudest. I had my clothes delivered from an old boutique on the Upper East Side. I chose a simple black dress with long sleeves, high collar, understated, unyielding. I pinned Henry's lapel watch to my chest, the last gift he had ever given me. I stood in front of the mirror in Savannah's apartment, inspecting the woman staring back. Her face was thinner, her eyes sharper, her skin marked with the memory of sea and stone. But she stood tall. She stood whole. "I'm ready," I said. Savannah nodded. The morning of the funeral, the venue was already swarming with reporters and guests. The chapel was high-ceilinged, ornate, full of stained glass and polished marble. A portrait of Henry stood near the altar, wreathed in white orchids. Beside it, a second photo, me, smiling, framed in silver. The caption read, "Forever Together." The gall of it nearly broke me. I waited in the hallway until Savannah gave the signal. The moment Bruck rose to speak, I stepped through the doors. The hush was immediate. I walked slowly, deliberately, the heels of my shoes striking the marble like a metronome. Gasps rose like smoke. A woman dropped her program. A man whispered, "Is that?" Bruck turned. Her eyes met. The color drained from her face. He stumbled back from the podium, knocking over the microphone. Alex stood frozen, mouth open, as I approached the front row and took my seat. No one spoke. Not yet. But they would. Silence is a powerful thing. It can stretch itself across a room and choke it dry. It can turn a crowd of hundreds into a cathedral of ghosts. That morning, as I walked to the front of the chapel and took my place in the pew reserved for the widow, silence wrapped around me like a crown. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The only sound was the echo of my heels fading into the high ceilings and the shallow gasps of those who had already begun to understand what my presence meant. Brooke stared at me from behind the podium, white-knuckled and trembling, her mouth opened and closed twice, like a fish pulled from water. She tried to smile, then realized there was no version of this moment she could twist to her favor. The words on her tongue shriveled before they reached the microphone. Slowly, she stepped back. I didn't need to say anything. I had already said everything simply by showing up. Alex didn't even stand. He remained seated beside the aisle, shoulders rigid, eyes wide. His jaw worked in slow circles, as if he were trying to chew through the situation. When I passed him, he shifted slightly, as though the mere nearness of me burned. I met his gaze for a moment and then turned away. He wasn't the one who pushed me overboard, but he hadn't lifted a finger to stop her. That made him just as guilty. The officiant cleared his throat, a feeble attempt to reclaim the service. We will take a moment to collect ourselves before continuing, he mumbled, then stepped down from the pulpit and disappeared behind a side door. The guests sat frozen, some clutching programs like lifelines, others whispering behind hands. Savannah stood quietly near the back, camera in hand, capturing every reaction. The room held its breath for another long minute. Then, I stood. The rustle of fabric and 100 swiveling heads followed me as I walked toward the front of the chapel. I didn't look at Brooke. I didn't need to. She had already begun to retreat, her face pale and slick with sweat, her hands trembling at her sides. Alex whispered something to her, something sharp and low, but she didn't hear him. She couldn't take her eyes off me. I turned toward the mourners. My name, I said, my voice calm and strong, is Mary Stewart. I am Henry Stewart's wife, and contrary to what you may have been told, I am not dead. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked. Several people rose from their seats instinctively, as if they couldn't decide whether to flee or applaud. I was with Henry when he passed. I held his hand. I heard his last breath. What I did not expect, I continued, my gaze now fixed on Brooke, was to be pushed off the side of our yacht and left to die in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea just hours later. Gasps this time. Audible, sharp. Someone cried out. Brooke made a choking noise, her hand flying to her throat. I survived, I said simply. For 6 days I survived on a barren island with nothing but seawater and determination. I was found, rescued, and brought home. And while I fought to stay alive, my would-be murderer sat in front of these cameras, weeping into silk and telling stories she made up herself. The room erupted into chaos, a rush of voices, of feet shuffling, of chairs scraping against marble. The officiant returned, flanked by 2 security guards, their eyes darting from me to the front of the room. One of them reached for his radio. Too late. Savannah stepped forward and spoke into a handheld mic. I am Savannah Lawson, journalist and legal witness. I have in my possession recorded statements, video evidence, and formal documentation supporting Mrs. Stewart's claims. What you are witnessing today is not a publicity stunt. It is a return and a reckoning. She nodded toward the projection screen behind the altar, which lit up a second later with the first of many damning images. Footage from the cargo ship showed me stepping aboard, wrapped in a blanket, battered and thin. The date and time were stamped clearly in the corner. Then came the clip of Brooke's interview, the one where she claimed I died by Henry's side. Liar. The screen switched to an image of the yacht's satellite tracker, its position that night never stopping, never circling back. Then the steward's testimony, then the will. Each piece chipped away at the polished lie Brooke had built. Each truth stripped her of the narrative she had tried so hard to control. Reporters in the back filmed everything. Phones were lifted, flashes went off. Savannah's assistant passed printed packets through the crowd, copies of timelines, quotes, satellite records, witness transcripts. It was no longer a funeral, it was a trial, and every person in the room was a juror. Rue collapsed into the chair behind her, burying her face in her hands. Alex stood now, shoulders drawn back, fury on his face. "This is insane," he barked. "She's manipulating everyone. She has no legal claim. Henry never signed the new will." I turned to face him. "Him intended to? He told me himself the night he died. And you knew it. That's why she pushed me. That's why you let her." Alex sneered, but I saw it then. His fear. His wife had committed a crime. He had covered it up. Even if the law couldn't touch them both today, the damage was done. Their empire was crumbling, and I was the one holding the torch. Security moved in then. One of the guards leaned over Brooke and asked her to come with them. She didn't resist. She stood with the slow, broken posture of someone who knew the fight was over. As they led her down the aisle, past the rows of stunned guests, I remained still. I didn't need to gloat. Justice didn't require cruelty. It only needed truth. Alex hesitated longer. He glanced once more at me, then followed after her, a man who had lost everything and had only himself to blame. Outside, the sky had darkened. A summer storm was rolling in. Thunder grumbled low in the distance. Reporters crowded the entrance, shouting questions, cameras thrust forward. Savannah held them at bay just long enough for me to step into the car waiting at the curb. The ride to the Foundation headquarters was quiet. Manhattan slid past the windows like a film on mute. Familiar streets, old buildings, strangers with umbrellas. I had walked these sidewalks for decades, a fixture in Henry's life, a respected name, a silent strength. They had tried to erase me. They had tried to bury me under their greed. But I had returned, and I had reclaimed my place. At the office, my lawyer greeted me with a firm handshake. "The board has called an emergency session," he said. "They've asked for your presence. They saw the broadcast." I straightened my shoulders. Let them see me in person. The boardroom was full when I arrived. Men and women I had known for years looked up as I entered, their faces a mixture of relief and guilt. They had believed Brooke, believed the narrative, but they knew better now. "Mrs. Stewart," one of them said, rising, "we're sorry." I took my seat at the head of the table. "Don't be," I said. "Just don't make the same mistake twice." We began proceedings immediately. By unanimous vote, Brooke and Alex were suspended from all company affairs pending investigation. Control of the Stewart Foundation was transferred fully to me. The shares Henry had left unassigned reverted to my oversight. What they had tried to steal through blood and lies had been returned by proof, by survival, by truth. Later that night, I sat alone in Henry's office. His chair still smelled faintly of cedar and the cologne he wore. I opened a drawer on the left and found what I was looking for. A letter, handwritten, dated 2 weeks before our final voyage. "Mary, if anything ever happens to me, don't let them silence you. You're stronger than all of them put together. They think wealth is power, but you and I both know truth is stronger. And you've always carried it well. Not Henry." I folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer. Then I turned out the light and stepped into the hallway. My heels echoed against the marble floor as I walked toward the elevator, toward the future. They thought they could erase me, that I was too old, too weak, too easy to dismiss. But I didn't disappear. I came back, and I came back to win. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next one, it might just be even more unbelievable. And if this hit you hard, share it with someone who needs to see it.